All right, CH is true. It really has been a long time. So I don't know how much back on the swing of things I'm going to be, but I'm going to give this a try. First of all, none of this art here is mine, so I can't claim credit for it, but I figured it's a backdrop, family member. So I could probably, here you go, there you go, there you go. So you can probably see, I mean, it's experimental, okay? Free speech, free expression, right here. We're going to get into it. And I'm going to start you off with a story from a number of years ago. When I was in university, there were a lot of activists, then as now, and I say great, okay, because the more activism, the more people stand up to injustice, the better. And I'm very glad to see very necessary conversations. Let me take a minute to acknowledge the life of George Floyd and the movement that he started, and the very necessary conversations that we're having, not just about police violence, which certainly in any free society we need to have that kind of conversation, but also conversations about inequity, about generational injustice, that if we're going to have a label of democracy, we need to have. But I want to tell you a story. And this was a story of some activists, and there was a huge gathering of homeless activists and a lot of radical activists, not liberal but radical activists. And there was a woman. She was a hero to that community for the number of times she's been arrested. Of course, naturally. That was university town for you. I was there. And she was arrested protesting. In those days, anti-war was a very big cause because there was actually a residual, it was the 90s, but the anti-nuclear movement of the 80s was still very much of a memory. So she was arrested for protesting against nuclear weapons. She was arrested for protesting apartheid in South Africa, destruction of the environment, police violence against African Americans and homeless folks. She was arrested for all number of causes. But I remember the man who was introducing her, and everybody was clapping. He said, and she was also arrested for protesting at City Hall against an abortion protest zone. Now, mind you, she was a feminist, pro-choice. She was adamantly against what these anti-abortion protesters were about, what their cause was, but, and this man said, she believes that everyone needs to have their say. And the crowd applauded. Because free speech was understood by them as necessary as a tool of working people to be able to stand up to corporate rule, to be able to stand up to militarism. If you look at World War I, you had all kinds of laws curtailing dissent because the Woodrow Wilson administration did not want people to be able to dissent during wartime because very few people do. But Eugene Debs dissented during wartime. In the 1960s, the Vietnam War protesters dissented during wartime, as well as protesting against racism. They would never have balance the idea of free speech against these other radical causes, because remember, to traditional libertarian socialism, I'm not talking about classical liberalism, I'm talking about traditional libertarian socialist ideology, censorship was always a tool of the ruling class. This is what they believed 25 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago. The statement, hate speech is not free speech, they would have understood. Well, first of all, no one's for hate speech. I mean, the answer to hate speech is justice speech, not love speech. I mean, yes, you want love speech, but it needs to be stronger than that. It needs to be justice speech. And this is what we're seeing, and that I do support. And this is very much not a criticism of this new trend that I'm seeing of activists not being as much in favor of free speech as in olden times, or at least segments of them. This is not a criticism from the right. I want you to understand that. This is not a criticism from either conservatism or quote, traditional liberalism, whatever that means. This is a statement from somebody who believes very much in the idea of protest, even if I don't 100% agree with every action. And we're going to table that one. That's not something that I'm going to dwell on right now. But I mean, I believe very much in the idea of speaking truth to power. But the idea of going to either the government or, interestingly enough, going to corporations like Facebook and saying, we need to put pressure on you to curtail speech would have been completely unthinkable. They would have very much seen corporate control of speech or governmental control of speech as being itself the structural domination that they were opposing. And I believe that a lot of the activists still do see it this way. I don't think that necessarily there's a monolithic group of people. There's not a them or those people. I don't really believe in that. But I do think that if you're an activist and you're watching this, you may want to ask the question. First of all, the first question you're probably asking is, yes, this is a recent haircut. Yes, I was able to get this during quarantine. Yes, legally, I was able to go down there and get it. But probably the question you're really wanting to ask is, more than anything else, is who ultimately will it benefit if free speech becomes something that's undermined? You know, the idea that hate speech isn't free speech in the hands of people who believe that being anti-Trump is hateful, or people who believe that opposing the next war is, quote, hate speech. Once they co-opt that meme, and they have a lot more power than an activist community does, either the corporations, including the so-called liberal, quote-unquote, ones in Silicon Valley, we can get to how liberal they really are, but certainly the oil companies and the defense contractors and the Trump administration are going to have vastly more power to curtail speech than you or I would. And this gets to a whole other conundrum of like, why advocate for an ideological tool that can easily be used in the service of racism or in the service of some sort of oppression or domination. Now, a lot of I just want to be clear, I mean, I don't want to minimize the fact that a lot of the online stuff is bad. And I understand that the need or the urge to tell Mark Zuckerberg, hey, you know, you need to put a lid on this. You know, let's make this family friendly. But this family friendly thing, I remember that from years ago. Family values, family friendly. I remember that was an ideological weapon to beat people over the head with, mainly by these kind of Republicans, who made some points about some of the stuff on television that, frankly, wasn't, you know, I wouldn't want any kid to watch. I understand that. Just like a lot of you who say things like, we need to put pressure on Mark Zuckerberg to curtail certain types of speech, can point to things that are really bad. I admit that. But I believe that the answer to hate speech is justice speech. It's having your own speech. It's being effective. And here's a very important point, and I know I'm waving my fingers. I don't mean to do that. The very important point is what Eugene Debs would do at a time like this he would try to unify people on an economic justice basis. That's going to be the way to get segments of working people that might be attracted to extreme ideology that's not very justice-oriented. You get them by submitting to them why it's in their interest to unify with African Americans and with other marginalized and oppressed groups. That seems to me the much better way to go than to ask the bosses or to ask the billionaires to start curtailing speech. That's one man's opinion. Thank you very much. CH is true.